Welcome to Pharma Source. In today's episode, we talk sustainability with Chris Shanahan, a procurement leader who is now Vice President of Global Sustainability Supply Chain at Thermo Fisher Scientific. Chris explains why he chose to focus on sustainability and ESG, what it means to him personally, and gives his advice on how to really get things done at a time when inflation is running high. Chris, you've had a lot of career experience in procurement in life sciences, first at GSK Consumer, now Haleon, and then to BD and Thermo Fisher, having spent the last 17 years plus as a CPO and literally written a handbook on how to be a procurement leader. So I'm keen to understand some of the lessons from that. But before I do, I've got to ask, why did you take on the challenge of leading sustainability?
Yeah, so as you said, I've probably spent 17 years at CPO. In the last year, I've been leading up a sustainability structure in the company. Part of it for me of why is really creating something for the future for my own children in some ways, to put it really bluntly, in the sense of, I think when you think about climate and what's going on in the world, there is a change, right? So there's so much impact, even if you think about this year alone, between fires and sort of unusual weather events that do go on. It is linked to a climate play. And when I think about the roles I have, and when you think about the impact on supply chains, we can influence this, okay? We can make things happen. So transitioning from a procurement lead into a sustainability lead in the supply chain, the way I think about it is getting things done, really executing and pulling through the commitments that companies make. And that's what we're doing within Thermo Fisher. Okay. So whether it's climate related, water, waste, these are areas that we're focused in on. And even, just human rights generally, and sort of the social side of what goes on in the supply chain, and making sure that there's fairness for workers in the workplace, right? So these are all topics that are really changing and evolving at a rapid pace. It's not that, it's the last 12, 18 months, I've seen a lot of change in terms of what expectations are, whether it's the customer, regulation, especially regulation in Europe, even here in the US, and just even the investor asking about what companies are doing across sustainability, ESG. And I've also noticed that there's companies with people similar like me that have made a move from procurement, supply chain into sustainability as well. So I don't see myself as unique anymore in this space.
I mean, there's obviously so much change which is happening at the moment. And unfortunately, it's not all in one positive direction towards a more sustainable planet. From your point of view in pharma and life sciences, what would you say the state of sustainability is today?
Yeah, in life science pharma, there's clearly an ambition. In our case, it's net zero by 2050. In some cases for pharma, it's 2045, 2040. So it varies by company in there. Another reason why I'm in the role is sort of saying, how do we really make it happen? What are the things we must do? And I think as you go through it, the infrastructure changes, the behavioral changes that need to happen, you need to bring people along. And it's all about, for me, aspiration and how quickly you can push, but also what's really logical and rational to get there. Some of this stuff takes time, I give an example. We got sites in countries and in states where the grids and the infrastructure are just not there. And if we set a 2030 goal or 2040 goal, we know it's not realistic because it's not us. We're dependent on so many other factors.
Mm-hmm. In pharma, how would you say events like COVID and then global inflation and everything that's followed that, how's that impacted the transition to a more sustainable industry?
It has an impact. There's no doubt about it, right? And it's sort of the impact here is from the impact we would see here is the ability for companies to invest at a quicker rate. So the investment cycle might get slightly delayed.
Mhm.
Because unfortunately, inflation, and it's pretty significant inflation that we see around the world, that does impact costs. And at the end of the day, companies have to run based on revenue and EBITDA goals. It's the nature of how the world does run. But it doesn't take away from the actual absolute goal, right? So you still have to, we still have a commitment for 2030, we still have a commitment for 2050. Our approach in the company has been one is ring fencing our commitment and making sure that the investment is still there, which we have done. And to be fair to our CEO, he's been very passionate about this. So we're making choices in other areas, right? So it's balancing the portfolio as we go through this. And I think most companies will go through this sort of pain and hurt and cycle. We are driving productivity. We have to. Okay, so when we go into the supply base will sort of say, well, you want productivity, but you also want us to set science-based targets. Okay, yes. However, the productivity in inflation is a cycle. So we're in an inflationary time frame. We will come out of it. It's like if you look over history, inflation happens, okay, but good times come back. So it's really how do you flatline and balance that over periods to sort of say, okay, yes, you need to make some investment, but when you get the good times, you might need to accelerate the investment. Okay, so it's really balancing the portfolio as we go forward. But the absolute goal of reduction in 2030 and 2050 doesn't really go away. I think that's important for us all to play to.
How do you break down the sustainability challenge? I mean, it's such a big, all-encompassing term.
Sure.
Do you sort of break it down into different buckets around, I don't know, packaging, transportation, ESG? What's your framework?
Yeah, so if you think, across the supply chain, you have two elements, two things, right? But if you think about E, there's carbon, water, and waste that we are focusing on. We see less when it comes to biodiversity and some of the other, forest, land, and agricultural aspects. But and then when you break down the carbon side, which is part of the E and carbon into scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3. Scope 1, scope 2 is within our four walls. So we're really looking at renewables, PPAs. We're looking at how do we look at our sites and sort of get to end of life and equipment and replace it with more less fossil in fossil sort of driven equipment, more electrical grid capacity. Scope 3 is the big nut, right? So the three areas on scope 3 we're focusing on is supplier and how we engage with the suppliers to get some science-based targets. Our carriers, and then carrier looks at your transportation mode, and you eventually get into networks and how you think about your network from a carrier point of view.
Would that include your partnership with United Airlines, for example?
Yeah, that would go more into the travel side of scope 3, right? So scope 3 has 15 different factors. Three factors make up the bulk of our emissions. Travel is clearly a factor, but it's less than 1% of our overall emissions. But doing something with United is good. That's something we have done and we'll continue to do as we think through using sustainable aviation fuel. If I get back to the other part of scope 3, which is product, which starts getting into things like packaging. Okay, so as you think about product and you're having a product that's net zero, but then you get into sort of things that impact the environment from a packaging point of view. So whether it's PVC free or polystyrene, or how do you recycle or your packaging, or even how you do circularity on your equipment. These are all things that impact the supply chain. They're all things that procurement has a big role to play in. Okay, it's sort of the interesting thing about procurement for me, as I reflect on my career, we've gone from a transactional based structure of do me the contract, leave me alone, to being a strong partner with the businesses as we think through resolving problems linked to product and the customer, and then the supply base has an important part in this.
Do you think that the complexity of what needs to be done to hit those sustainability targets, do you feel that's fully understood by the business?
Probably not. There's a lot of education that we have to continue to do, and the complexity is, I think, not only the business. I think generally people, it's a general thing. We all have to get educated on what does it mean. It sort of does impact a lot of things of how we buy, how we think about where we place things. What are truly things that are impacting the environment versus nice to have. Even if I take packaging, yes, packaging is an important part of it. It really is, and we need to continue to drive that. But when you think of the overall ecosystem of greenhouse gas emissions, it's a small percentage. Okay, so in our space, okay, now if you're a heavy packaging and producer or a user, yeah, that's so it all depends on the industry and what industry you play in around this. But the complexity in here, for us, is going to be data. It's just the ability to get the right type of data, and that gives us the right information we need to actually make the right decisions on what we have to do in reducing our footprint. And that's where our biggest challenge is today.
I wonder if you could tell me a couple of initiatives that you've been working on, which have been really successful in educating the business about what they need to do, or have made inroads into some of those targets.
Yeah, so there's probably a number of different areas. I think if I take education first, so I think the first thing here is just the basics of what is scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3. Okay, when we talk about it, what is it actually? What does it really mean? Okay, and then how do we actually look at it and sort of say in our day-to-day environment, right? So what do we have to do to actually go address it? So it's some basic, 101 stuff of what is scope 1, scope 2, scope 3, and then some realism of what is feasible today versus what's going to be feasible in the next sort of 3, 5, 10 years, because it is a journey. Okay, things we have done, within this space. If I think about scope two for us, and we will be pretty soon able to sort of say that our renewables, we'll have greater than 80% of our energy through renewables, right? So we're pretty confident with that right now, and we see that in the next couple of years. To get to 100% on that, it requires some infrastructure to be put in place in Asia, which is the gap for us on that.
Or moving operations to Switzerland. That's the other alternative.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's interesting you say that, is that the networks, and this is the piece around complexity in the future. As you think about networks and placing networks, I can see how you think about greenhouse gases as an input into where you actually put your network. Okay, we're not doing that today. I won't say we're consciously doing that today, but I can see where companies will take that as a decision point in their networks. I think that's a way to address it. How you move goods around the place is the same thing. Okay, so it's really, it could change the dynamic of how you think about where you place your sites, how you supply the markets, as you go forward, right? So it's an evolution. It'll be, to be fair, but yeah, renewables is an important part. The other thing we have done is we've got about 50 key sites that make up 80% of our overall emissions. And we've done pretty detailed planning on what we need to do with those sites to get them to net zero. And part of that will also be is going to be thinking about the technologies needed to enable that, right? So what are the companies we need to work with on technologies? What are the sort of the grids, electrical grids that we have to work with and partner with to think about how we actually get there as well. So it's really building the detailed plans to enable some of this stuff. I think then the last area I would sort of say we've started doing some supplier days with with our supply base, similar to many other companies that are doing it as well in the life science spaces, and really trying to educate, but also see what help do they need to actually get on this journey as well, right? So it's sort of, the way I think about this is that we are dependent on many sort of cogs and nodes, and it's our supply configuration is an important part of that. We have to help them as much as them helping us.
Thinking back about your time as CPO, I wonder if there are a few lessons or experiences you could share so that other procurement professionals can be successful in pharma, which has got quite unique dynamics for procurement. What does it take to be a successful business partner?
Yeah, it could be a couple of areas for me. Networking and listening to your stakeholders and sort of making sure you're addressing the true business requirements that the business really needs. Okay, so I'm going to come back to when I started out in this world of procurement. Procurement was known for price. Okay, all you care about is the price. You do something and you move on to the next contract. Okay, so that's not business partnership, right? So really, business partnership piece is really understanding what the true requirements are for that business. How you make them successful? How do you grow revenue and impact revenue in there? So it's really coming at it from a business mindset versus from what I call a sourcing transactional mindset. So and it's evolved, but it's still an important part of connecting with the business and building the network. I think the second area would be you have to be patient in some of the things that we do in procurement, right? So we generally have some pretty good ideas that come to the table, but the business is not ready for it. But it's a timing piece, okay? So you have to think through what are the strategies that you could drive and help the business with, but also lay them out in a way that they can be modular, right? So it's and sort of don't get into a spiral of frustration, because it can be frustrating when you're in procurement, because the ideas are good. And so why won't they do this? And the reality of it is it's not a priority in their head. They're being measured in a different way, and there's no burning platform. Experience tells and shows, and I've seen the ideas that you have today, they might get executed in 3 or 5 years' time, but they will get executed. So it's a timing piece, right? So it's just really being thoughtful and sort of pressure test that. And then I think the other area I would sort of say to people is one size does not fit all, right? So it's processes are processes, and you sort of say this is the way we should run, but you have to be agile enough to actually sort of follow the cracks and sort of say, okay, how do I make the process work? I might need to make a slight tweak, depending on the situation. Okay, so being rigid doesn't help the business. Sometimes you have to sort of be agile, okay, to enable the business, but do it in a way that you're not breaking any sort of boundaries, right? So it's really making sure that doing it with integrity and with the right ethical practices in there. But it's just don't just think through that a process is something that it gives you a glide, but you need to be flexible and agile in there.
If there was one thing that listeners could do to drive the sustainability agenda in their company, what would you say that is?
Get started. Just get started. It can be intimidating. It can be overwhelming. There's a lot out there that's going on, and we don't have all the information. If everybody can get started, everybody will come together eventually to where we need to get to. For me, it's as simple as that. Don't put it off.
Chris, it's been a pleasure speaking to you. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
For more insights and best practices into sustainability, make sure you register to pharmasource.global. Thank you for listening.